The Green New Deal was launched, if you like, into the climate breakdown debate because the Greens, on the whole, tended to talk about individual behavior change and about community change, about recycling and reusing. And so the responsibility, in a sense, was being passed on to individuals and onto communities. And they did not talk enough about the need for structural change. And the Green New Deal is about structural change, not just structural change in the use of fossil fuels, in other words, how we have to just stop using fossil fuels now because it's almost too late already, but secondly, how the financial and economic system is tightly integrated into the ecosystem. And to help you understand what I mean by that, we have a deregulated financial system, essentially. Of course, if you speak to bankers and financiers, they'll complain about endless regulations. But in effect, the system is deregulated. It's beyond the reach, if you like, of sovereign governments. The financial system operates in what I like to call the stratosphere, but it's beyond the boundaries, the political and economic boundaries of nation states, which is why JP Morgan Chase, for example, in the 3 years after the Paris Climate Agreement, lent $196 billion to coal, gas, and oil companies around the world, not in just one country. Compare that to Exxon, that it invested only $3 billion a year for 3 years after the Paris Climate Agreement. And you can see the banks play a very big part in providing the oxygen that fires up global warming. The banks are in a position to create credit almost effortlessly and almost without government intervention, without central bank guidance as to where that credit is aimed at and for what purposes it's being used, and above all, how it's going to be repaid. The finance sector, both the traditional finance sector but also the shadow banking sector, because we now have a banking sector that operates in the shadows, are able to create credit, if you like, ad infinitum, and they have done. And if you don't believe me, all you have to look at are the IMF's numbers on the level of global debt, because debt is, of course, just the other side of credit. And so they've spewed out enormous amounts of credit, and that credit in turn fuels consumption and production, and that in turn fuels emissions. And so what we argued when we were drafting the Green New Deal is that unless you can think of the system as a system and not as the ecosystem as this bit of it which we have to hug and look after, but really as something that's deeply integrated into the financial system. So in order to address the question of emissions and the ecosystem, we have to first and foremost address the financial system and the economic system.
What is the metaphor that can most helpfully guide us through this, do you think? What sort of scale are we talking about? And can we reach beyond our current mindset to get there? Or are we really asking ourselves for something which is really too much for us to handle? Have we unleashed forces that we now can't control?
The scale of this crisis is unprecedented. We're talking here about the survival of our civilization. There is going to be a catastrophic crisis. And of course, if it happens in Bangladesh or in Mozambique, nobody will take any notice. But if New York City was to endure something worse than Hurricane Sandy, and if Wall Street were to be flooded and disappear, I can assure you that tomorrow we'd do something, right? And it's not that improbable. People forget that it was only a year, 18 months ago, that Cape Town, which is a city on the sea, ran out of water. And, of course, Cape Town is a long way away and didn't affect us, but it ran out of water. James Meek's got a wonderful piece in this week's London Review of Books about St Albans. St Albans has drained its chalk water, water supplies, basically, is drying up. St Albans is now a sort of suburban city. It's now a place from where city workers commute to get into the city of London. What happens if they run out of water? What happens if London runs out of water? What happens if London is flooded? It seems to me we could have that kind of crisis which would, boom, trigger us into action straight away. That's one possibility. Another possibility, I am afraid to say, is war. We now have trade wars happening, which we haven't had for a very long time. And we all know trade wars lead to real wars. There are very big political tensions out there. We have a very incompetent American president with enormous power and with access to nuclear weapons. You know, I don't want to be too alarmist about this, but I want us to be thinking that the people in charge of the nuclear weapons today are a bit bonkers, some of them really. And then thirdly, there is the very, very, very real chance of another global financial crisis. I mean, the IMF 2 days ago has pressed the panic button. And for the IMF to do that is extraordinary, really. So it's not just little old me saying this. These big institutions are really scared. The global system is now massively imbalanced. Huge amounts of debt, not enough income. Huge amounts of debt, lots of austerity. Europe, you know, held back, if you like, by austerity. And Keynes famously once said, you can't balance the nation's budget by cutting the nation's income. But for the last 11 years, we've let the finance sector run wild, you know, and create credit and expand, and we've encouraged it with QE and so on and so forth, and we now have more debt than we had before the last crisis, while at the same time fiscal policies have repressed incomes very deliberately, and that's caused massive imbalances. When you have imbalances like that, you get crises just as sure as night follows day.